remember this day right here. Oh, wow. I missed you guys so much. We're together again.
The bartender's name was Chris Pelletier, and he thought he was doing the right thing. It was a Thursday night in November of 2017 at a place called Hanlon's Pub in Oceanside, California, about 4 miles from the main gate of Camp Pendleton. Chris had been tending bar at Hanlon's for 3 years. He knew his regulars. He knew when someone had crossed the line from relaxing into a problem, and when the old man at the corner table ordered his 5th bourbon in 2 hours and sat there staring at a photograph he'd pulled from his shirt pocket. Chris made the call. He walked over, set down a glass of water, and told the man gently that he was cutting him off for the night. He said it wasn't personal. He said he could call someone if the man needed a ride. The old man looked up at him with eyes that were wet but steady. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He just nodded once, folded the photograph carefully, and slid it back into his pocket. Then he said something Chris didn't understand at the time. He said they'll be here soon. Chris assumed the man was confused. He assumed the bourbon was talking. He went back behind the bar and started wiping down glasses and keeping one eye on the old man the way you do when you're worried someone might fall off a chair. 20 minutes later, the front door opened and 14 men walked into Hanlon's Pub in a single group. Every one of them was over 60. Every one of them was wearing the same faded olive drab cap with a scarlet and gold emblem on the front, and every one of them walked straight to the corner table where the old man was sitting. If this story already has your attention, comment Semper Fi below and stay with me. The old man's name was Arthur Devereaux. He was 74 years old, 5'9", 152 pounds, with white hair cut close to his skull in the same high and tight he'd worn since he was 18. Arthur had been a Marine. That fact defined him more completely than anything else in his life, including 2 marriages, 3 children, 41 years of civilian employment as a millwright at a paper plant in Jacksonville, North Carolina, and a quiet retirement to a small apartment in Oceanside, where he could still smell the salt air and hear the helicopters from Pendleton when the wind was right. Arthur Devereaux enlisted in the United States Marine Corps in 1963 at the age of 19. He was assigned to 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines, a unit whose lineage stretched back to the Banana Wars and whose battle honours included some of the most savage fighting in the Pacific during World War II. By the time Arthur joined, the battalion was preparing for a different kind of war. In 1965, 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines deployed to the Republic of Vietnam as part of the initial Marine build-up in I Corps. Arthur was a Lance Corporal in Fox Company. His MOS was 0311, Infantry Rifleman. He carried an M14 rifle, 60 pounds of gear, and the quiet certainty of a young man who believed he was doing the right thing. The battle that brought Arthur Devereaux to Hanlon's Pub every November was Operation Hastings, launched on July 15, 1966, in Quang Tri Province near the demilitarized zone. Intelligence reports indicated that the 324B Division of the North Vietnamese Army had crossed into South Vietnam with an estimated 8,000 troops. The mission was to find them and push them back across the DMZ. It was one of the first large-scale engagements between US Marines and regular NVA forces, and it was brutal. The terrain was mountainous jungle so dense that helicopter resupply was nearly impossible in some landing zones. The NVA were dug in, disciplined, and fighting on ground they knew better than anyone. Over the course of the operation, 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines fought through ambushes, bunker complexes, and close-range firefights that sometimes devolved into hand-to-hand combat. On July 18th, Fox Company was advancing along a ridgeline toward a suspected NVA staging area when they walked into a prepared L-shaped ambush. Automatic weapons fire raked the column from 2 directions. The lead squad was pinned down in a streambed with casualties mounting. Arthur Devereaux was in the 2nd squad. He was 22 years old. What Arthur did in the next 47 minutes was documented in the after-action report filed by his company commander. He moved forward under fire to the lead squad's position, dragged 2 wounded Marines behind a rock formation that provided partial cover, and then laid down suppressive fire with his M14 to allow a 3rd Marine to crawl to safety. When his rifle jammed from the mud and debris, he picked up an M14 from a fallen Marine and continued firing. He wasn't decorated for exceptional heroism that day. No medal citation was written for what he did. He was simply one of dozens of Marines in Fox Company who did what they had to do to keep their brothers alive. But 4 men from the lead squad didn't make it out of that streambed. Their names were Lance Corporal David Eubanks, PFC Michael Toomey, Lance Corporal James Alford, and Corporal Raymond Sweetser. Arthur Devereux had known all 4 of them. He'd eaten chow with them, shared cigarettes with them, complained about the heat with them, and made the same jokes every 20-year-old makes when he's scared and far from home and trying not to show it. Arthur carried those 4 names for 51 years. He carried them the way veterans carry the dead, which is to say silently, constantly, and with a weight that doesn't diminish with time. He never talked about the stream bed. He never talked about the ambush. He didn't attend therapy groups or write about his experiences or seek recognition. He went to work, he raised his children, he mowed his lawn, and every year on the anniversary of that ambush he went to a bar and he sat alone and he drank bourbon and looked at a photograph of Fox Company taken 3 weeks before Operation Hastings. In the photograph, 26 young Marines stood in 2 rows in front of a sandbag wall, squinting into the sun, some of them smiling, all of them still alive. Arthur could name every man in that picture. Chris Pelletier didn't know any of this when he cut Arthur off. He didn't know that the photograph Arthur kept touching was 51 years old. He didn't know that Arthur was sitting at that specific table, because it was the same table he'd sat at for the past 9 years on this exact date. Chris had only been at Hanlon's for 3 years. The bartenders before him had known. The owner of Hanlon's had known. But Chris was new, relatively speaking, and nobody had thought to tell him about the old Marine who came in every November and drank quietly in the corner and waited. The 14 men who walked through the door were the surviving members of Fox Company, 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines, who had served together during the 1966 and 1967 deployments. At their peak, the reunion group had numbered 23. Time and mortality had whittled them down. Cancer took some. Heart disease took others. A few simply stopped coming without explanation, and later their families would call one of the other members to say they'd passed. Every year the group got smaller. Every year the ones who remained showed up anyway. They came from all over the country, from Florida and Texas and Pennsylvania and Oregon and places in between. They drove or flew or took buses. One of them, a man named Harold Kiesling, had driven 11 hours from a small town in New Mexico with a bad hip and a worse transmission in his truck because he said missing the reunion wasn't something he was willing to do while he still had legs that worked. They all wore the same cap, olive drab with the 4th Marines emblem on the front and the years of their service embroidered on the back. Some of the caps were frayed at the brim. Some had been restitched where the embroidery had come loose. None of them were new. These were not men who bought replacement caps. They wore the originals until the originals fell apart, and then they patched them and kept wearing them, because the cap wasn't a fashion choice. It was a statement. It said I was there. Chris Pelletier watched from behind the bar as the 14 men converged on Arthur's table. He watched them embrace him one at a time, not the quick backslap hugs that men use when they're uncomfortable with affection. These were real embraces, arms wrapped tight, hands gripping shoulders, heads close together, words spoken that nobody else in the bar could hear. Arthur stood for each one of them. He'd been slumped in his chair for 2 hours, looking like a man the world had forgotten, and now he was on his feet, shoulders back, shaking hands and pulling men close and saying their names, the way you say the name of someone you weren't sure you'd see again. Chris realized he'd made an error. A well-intentioned, reasonable, completely wrong error. The old man hadn't been drinking alone out of despair. He hadn't been spiraling. He'd been holding a post. He was the first one there because he was always the first one there. He arrived early and he sat at the table and he waited for his unit because that's what Arthur Devereux did. He secured the position and he waited for his men. The group moved to the back room of Hanlon's. It was a space the bar used for private events, with a long wooden table that could seat about 20 dim lighting, and a collection of old photographs on the walls showing Oceanside in the 1940s and 50s, when the town was nothing but a handful of buildings and a whole lot of Marines. The Fox Company veterans filled the table and started ordering. Beer and bourbon and club soda for the ones who'd quit drinking years ago and didn't feel the need to explain why. Chris served them himself. He brought the drinks and he didn't rush them and he didn't make small talk. He could feel something in that room that told him to be quiet and do his job and pay attention. The story started about 30 minutes in. They came slowly at first, the way they always did, like an engine that needs to warm up before it runs smooth. Someone mentioned a name, someone else remembered a detail, and then the stories rolled out one after another in a rhythm that 50 years of retelling had made seamless. They talked about boot camp. They talked about the ship to Vietnam. They talked about the first patrol and the way the jungle sounded at night, and the time PFC Danny Ackerman accidentally set off a trip flare during a night ambush, and the entire company had to relocate in the dark. That story got a laugh the way it always did. Danny Ackerman had died in 2009, but his story was still alive at this table, and the men who told it were keeping him present the only way they knew how. They talked about the serious things too. They talked about the ambush on the ridgeline. They talked about the stream bed. They said the 4 names out loud: Eubanks, Toomey, Alford, Sweetser. One of the men, a former sergeant named Lyle Patchett, had brought a printed list of every Fox Company Marine killed during the 1966 deployment. There were 11 names on the list. He read them aloud while the table was silent. When he finished, Arthur Devereux raised his glass and said present. The other 14 men raised their glasses and repeated it. Present. It was a roll call for men who would never answer again, spoken by men who answered for them every year in a back room in Oceanside because someone had to. Because if the living didn't say their names, the dead would become statistics, and these men would not allow that. Not while they still had breath and memory and a table to sit at. Chris Pelletier stood in the doorway during the roll call. He didn't enter the room. He didn't move. He held a tray of drinks that he'd been about to deliver, and he stood perfectly still while 11 names were read, and 15 glasses were raised. His eyes stung. He was 29 years old. He'd never served in the military. He'd never lost a friend to war. He'd never understood, not really, what it meant to carry a name for half a century and refuse to let it go. He understood it now, not completely. Maybe you can never completely understand it unless you've been there. But he understood enough to know that what was happening in that back room was sacred, and that he'd almost disrupted it by cutting off the man who made it possible. The stories went on until closing time. They talked for 4 straight hours. They laughed more than Chris expected. The laughter was the thing that surprised him most. He'd assumed that a reunion built around a battle anniversary would be somber from start to finish. It wasn't. These men had known each other when they were young and scared and full of the dark humour that keeps soldiers sane. That humour hadn't aged out of them. They told stories that made them double over in their chairs. They interrupted each other. They argued about details that didn't matter. Was the sandbag wall in the photograph on the north side or the east side of the compound? Was it Sergeant Hewitt or Sergeant Hartley who fell into the latrine? Did the mail run come on Tuesdays or Wednesdays? They debated these things with the intensity of men who needed the details to be right because the details were all they had left. The facts were the architecture of their memory, and if one fact slipped, the whole structure might follow. At 11:45, 15 minutes before closing, Arthur stood up and the table went quiet. He reached into his shirt pocket and took out the photograph, the same one Chris had seen him staring at earlier. He held it up so the table could see it. 26 faces, 2 rows, sandbag wall, sun in their eyes. Arthur said something that Chris could barely hear from the doorway, but later asked one of the men to repeat. Arthur said another year. We're still here. He placed the photograph on the table, and every man at that table leaned in to look at it, even though they had all seen it 100 times before. They pointed at faces. They said names. They touched the photograph gently, the way you touch something that's irreplaceable, which it was. The group settled their tab at midnight. The total bill for the evening was $482. Drinks for 15 men over the course of 4.5 hours, plus 3 rounds of appetizers that Chris had sent out to the back room without being asked because it seemed like the right thing to do. He charged them for the drinks and comped the food. When Arthur asked for the check, it was Lyle Patchett who took it from his hand and put a credit card down without looking at the total. The tip Lyle left was $1,500. Chris stared at it. He told Lyle there had to be a mistake. Lyle shook his head. He said there's no mistake. He said this bar gives us a place to remember our brothers every year. He said you can't put a price on that, but $1,500 seemed like a start. Chris tried to argue. Lyle gave him a look that ended the conversation. It was the look of a man who had made a decision and was not interested in having it reviewed. The men filed out of Hanlon's one by one, shaking hands with Chris as they passed. Several of them thanked him for the food. One of them, a quiet man named George Okada, who'd barely spoken all night, stopped at the door and told Chris something that reframed the entire evening. He said Arthur gets here early every year because he's afraid one year he'll show up and nobody else will come. He said the reason Arthur drinks before they arrive is because the waiting is the hardest part. Sitting alone in a bar wondering if this is the year the table stays empty. George said the thing that keeps Arthur going is knowing that when those doors open, he'll see the caps come through. Chris nodded and didn't trust himself to speak. George patted him on the shoulder and walked out into the November night. Arthur was the last to leave. He stopped at the bar and looked at Chris. There was no anger in his face, no resentment about being cut off earlier. Arthur understood what Chris had been trying to do. He'd lived long enough to know the difference between someone who was being cruel and someone who was trying to help and got it wrong. He told Chris that he'd see him next year. Chris said the table would be ready. Arthur put on his cap, adjusted it with the care of a man straightening uniform, and walked out. Chris Pelletier locked up Hanlon's pub that night and sat at the bar alone for a long time before going home. He thought about what he'd seen. He thought about 15 old men raising their glasses and saying the word present for 11 men who died in a jungle before Chris was born. He thought about the photograph and the way Arthur's hands trembled slightly when he held it up. He thought about the $1,500 tip and what it actually represented, which wasn't generosity in the conventional sense. It was tribute. The money was a way of saying this place matters to us. Keep it standing, because we need it for as long as we're still here. The next morning, Chris talked to the owner of Hanlon's, a man named Pete Hanlon, whose father had opened the place in 1952 specifically because of its proximity to Camp Pendleton and the Marine base population. Pete confirmed everything. He said the Fox Company group had been coming to the pub every November for almost a decade. His father had known about it before he passed the business down. There was no formal reservation system. Arthur just showed up, and the table was understood to be his. Pete told Chris that his father had considered it a point of honour that the reunion happened at Hanlon's, and that he should consider it the same way. Chris asked if they'd ever had any problems with the group. Pete laughed and said the only problem was making sure the back room was clean and the bourbon was stocked. From that night forward, Chris Pelletier handled the November reunion personally. He reserved the back table a week in advance. He made sure the specific brand of bourbon Arthur preferred, Maker's Mark, was fully stocked. He prepared a printed menu of appetizers and kept the kitchen open late. He learned the names of the men who came every year. He learned which ones drank beer and which ones had switched to soda, and which ones still took their bourbon neat despite what their doctors said. He never cut Arthur off again. Not because he stopped paying attention, because he understood now what the drinking meant and what the waiting meant and what the photograph meant. The reunion continued every November. In 2018, 13 men came. Earl McBride from Pensacola had suffered a stroke in August and couldn't travel. His son called Arthur to say his father was sorry, and that he'd be watching from the hospital and thinking about them. In 2019, 12 men came. Harold Kiesling, the man who'd driven 11 hours from New Mexico with the bad hip, had finally lost the argument with his body. He passed in June of that year. His cap was mailed to Arthur by Harold's daughter, with a note that said, "Dad wanted you to have this." Arthur brought the cap to the reunion and set it on an empty chair at the table. Nobody sat in that chair. In 2020, the reunion didn't happen. The pandemic shut Hanlon's down for months. Arthur sat alone in his apartment on the anniversary date and called every surviving member of the group. The calls lasted the entire day. In 2021, 10 men came. 2 more empty chairs, 2 more caps. Chris set a glass of bourbon in front of each empty chair without being asked. In 2022, 8 men came. The table was getting quieter. The stories were the same, but the voices telling them were fewer. The laughter was still there, but it came with longer pauses. The roll call of the dead had grown beyond the 11 names from 1966. It now included the names of Fox Company Marines who had survived the war but not the decades that followed. The list Lyle Patchett read that year had 29 names on it. 29 glasses were raised. 29 times the word present echoed off the walls of the back room at Hanlon's pub. Arthur Devereux is 79 years old now. His hair is thinner and his steps are slower, and the tremor in his hands that Chris first noticed in 2017 has gotten worse. But every November he drives to Hanlon's pub, parks his car in the same spot, walks through the front door and sits at the corner table. He puts the photograph on the table, he orders a Maker's Mark, and he waits. He waits because he's been waiting at that table for years and he'll keep waiting until he can't anymore. He waits because the door might open and the caps might come through, and he'll hear the voices of men who shared the worst and best days of his life. He waits because that's what Marines do. They hold the position. They don't leave until everyone's accounted for. Chris Pelletier still tends bar at Hanlon's. He's 35 now. He's never served in the military, and he probably never will. But every November, He puts on a clean shirt and he sets up the back room and he makes sure the bourbon is stocked and the table is ready. He does it because he stood in a doorway one night and heard 15 old men say the word present for brothers who couldn't answer anymore, and it changed something in him that hasn't changed back. He does it because an old man in a faded cap taught him that drinking alone isn't always what it looks like. Sometimes it's a man holding a position, sometimes it's a Marine waiting for his unit, and sometimes the most respectful thing a bartender can do isn't to cut someone off, it's to pour the drink and keep the table open and trust that the man sitting there knows exactly what he's doing. The back room at Hanlon's pub has a wall near the long table where Chris has started hanging things. There's a framed copy of the Fox Company photograph, reprinted with Arthur's permission and enlarged so the faces are clear. Below it are the caps of the men who've passed. Each one hangs on a small brass hook with a nameplate beneath it. Harold Kiesling, Earl McBride, George Okada, the quiet man who told Chris about the waiting. Others whose hooks have been added year by year. The wall isn't a memorial in the official sense. There's no plaque from the city, no dedication ceremony, no ribbon cutting. It's a wall in a bar where a bartender decided to honour something he witnessed, and where the surviving members of a Marine company know that their brothers' names are on display in a place that mattered to them. The caps hang there year-round, not just in November. Anyone who walks into Hanlon's on any day of the year can see them. Most people don't ask about them. The ones who do, Chris tells the story. He tells it the way Arthur would want it told. Simply, without exaggeration, without sentimentality, just the facts. A group of Marines fought together in Vietnam. They lost brothers. Every year they come back to this bar to say their names. The caps belong to the ones who can't come back anymore. That's the story. It's enough. There is a kind of loyalty that doesn't depend on proximity or frequency of contact. It doesn't require daily communication or shared zip codes or social media connections. It's the loyalty of men who went through something together that can't be replicated or fully explained to anyone who wasn't there. It's the loyalty that makes a 79-year-old man drive to a bar every November and sit alone and wait, because the possibility that one more brother might walk through that door is worth any amount of waiting. It's the loyalty that makes a man drive 11 hours on a bad hip because missing the reunion isn't an option. It's the loyalty that turns a back room in a pub into hallowed ground, not because of what the room is, but because of what happens there once a year when a group of old men raise their glasses and speak the names of the dead into the air so the silence doesn't swallow them. Subscribe to my channel if you understand that some bonds aren't made by choice. They're forged by fire, and the men who carry those bonds don't let go of them. Not after 50 years. Not after the world forgets. Not ever.